welcome to the penultimate session. And for this one, after really a fantastic couple of days, we're going to have a sort of panel discussion, sort of looking at, what are the opportunities, what's next for blue carbon in New England. And so we've assembled a really excellent lineup for the panelists. I hope are going to be very provocative in their ideas, bring forward ideas. And I hope the audience is going to be very provocative in asking them questions. What I'd like to do for this, I'll give an introduction to each of our panelists and then open up with a couple of questions just to get the conversation flowing. And then I'd like to open it up to the room, and then I'll wrap up towards the end. And so just to welcome our panelists, starting based upon landscape position, I'll start at that end of the table. Jon Kachmar is with the Massachusetts Coastal Program. He's the Massachusetts Coastal Program Director of the Nature Conservancy. Jon is the Program Director with responsibilities for statewide coastal conservation and restoration work, as well as regional efforts from Cape Cod to Long Island Sound. He's an undergraduate degree in marine affairs from the University of Rhode Island and a master's degree in public policy and management from the University of Southern Maine, focusing on coastal zone management. Jon is an avid sailor, a fly fisherman, and a backcountry skier. Welcome, Jon. Aisling O'Shea. Aisling is with the Global Warming Solutions. She's the Global Warming Solutions Manager with the Massachusetts Executive Office for Energy and Environment Affairs. Aisling O'Shea has more than 20 years' experience in the environmental policy and planning, working primarily with the public sector on climate change, environment impact assessment, sustainability development, and natural resource management. She currently serves as Global Warming Solutions Program Manager and has, in her work, focuses on evaluation of Commonwealth progress in implementing the Global Warming Solutions Act and preparing updates for the Massachusetts Clean Water Energy and Climate Plan for 2020. Our third panelist is Tim Purinton. Tim is Director of the Massachusetts Department of Fisheries and Game Division of Ecological Restoration. The department was created, pardon me, my glasses are not very good today. The department was 2009 to meet the needs of a statewide ecological-based restoration program. Tim oversees the national award-winning division that coordinated over 60 river, wetland, and stream flow restoration projects across the state. DER staff currently manage a project of an annual budget of $17 million, most of which is grant funded. And finally, but not least, Kristin Wilson is Coordinator of Research at the Wells National Estuary Research Reserve. She's an interdisciplinary scientist interested in response of salt marshes and mangroves to climate change and coastal land use change. Many mangroves in Wells?
Not there.
She is a graduate of Middlebury College and has a master's degree in marine biology and marine policy, and a PhD in ecology and environmental science, all from the University of Maine. Currently, she is the research director at Wells NER. So thank you all. Welcome. So for a first question, I would just like a very short question to begin with. The first question, maybe 2 minutes of response each. Could you please tell me a little bit about your organization that you work for and your interest in blue carbon? Please. Let's start with Jon.
Sure. The Nature Conservancy obviously has a lot of vested interest in blue carbon, regardless of how we count it, but the mangroves and salt marsh and seagrass and shellfish beds are becoming front and center for the Nature Conservancy over the last 10 years, really, in full swing. We've made a big transition from the green landscape to the blue landscape. We've done that globally. We've also done that on a state-by-state and regional basis as well. So that's true here in Massachusetts and New England. We've made a big swing. Specifically in terms of blue carbon, we have, I wouldn't say we've been leaders in this realm, but we have been engaged somewhat recently We did do a global mangrove biomass mapping project, 2013, a Texas coastwide assessment in 2014, if I'm remembering correctly, of blue carbon in Texas, including some inland areas and watershed areas in the state. The Natural Capital Project, known as INVEST, measuring ecosystem services. So we have had some engagement in this, but I have to say it's not part of our day-to-day discussions within the Conservancy. I don't know, can't tell you where that's going to go or how front and center this will get, but I will just finish up by saying we really have a vested interest in this topic and the resources, the coastal resources that are behind blue carbon for sure.
Thank you, Jon. Aisling, can you tell us a little bit about your organization, please?
So, okay, thanks. Okay, so do I have to bring it up real close? Is that okay? Okay. So I work with the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and we are charged with both protection of natural resources as well as moving the state towards a clean energy future. For those of you who may not be familiar with EEA, we have several agencies, including Department of Environmental Protection, Coastal Zone Management, and Department of Fish and Game, and also Department of Agriculture, Energy Resources, and Public Utilities, some of the main agencies. So the energy and environment was integrated within the agency several years ago. But from the blue carbon perspective, in terms of coastal wetlands, we have several of our agencies who work on wetlands and related climate issues, including Coastal Zone Management, DEP, and Division of Ecological Restoration, which Tim will speak about. I'm going to speak primarily about our interest in blue carbon from the perspective of the Global Warming Solutions Program at EEA. So we're charged with implementing the Global Warming Solutions Act, which was brought into law in 2008, and evaluating our progress towards the goals from that act, which are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 25% by 2020 and 80% by 2050, and that's compared to 1990 baselines. And our interest in our plan covers, energy, land use, transportation, etc. But we primarily, from the blue carbon perspective, our interest in that emerged last year when we heard about the work that Webner was doing on the methane emissions and the analysis of tidal restoration projects. So that was of interest to us too, as we were in part, we were looking into supplemental strategies for our clean energy and climate plan, and we were curious to find out, what was going on, what were the results of the studies, is there potential here to for emission reductions. Also at the time, it sort of tied in like at the time when we were also considering like how do we best account for the carbon impacts of land alteration as part of our greenhouse gas inventory. And how do we, incorporate issues of carbon storage and sequestration when we're evaluating our progress towards the 2020 and 2050 goals. So that's kind of like how our interest in the blue carbon came about. We are also thinking at the time when this conversation happened last year, we were also, a lot of interest and attention was being paid to natural gas pipeline leaks, and we need to look at how we're going to address that as part of the plan. How do we reduce methane emissions from there? So it was interesting to see that there's, there may also be a potential on the, on the blue carbon side. So interested in learning more about that. So that's kind of where we're looking at it from different perspectives, the carbon storage and sequestration, the potential for methane emission reductions, and just overall the broader ecosystem values and cross-cutting mitigation adaptation aspects of the blue carbon world are something that we're interested in, exploring further.
Great, thank you very much, Aisling. Tim, please.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Hold on. I'm just going to pull that up. So I coordinate a ecological restoration program in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which is fairly unique if you look at state structures. There are very few dedicated ecological restoration groups. Oftentimes they're nested in wildlife management or fisheries and wildlife. And because of that, we're sort of on the cutting edge in terms of justifying our program's worth. We're not, we don't have a mandate from the legislature. We don't have regulations that we must oversee. And so I have to coordinate a program and I have to justify the benefits of wetland restoration. It's really, in many respects, I have to be a salesperson for the work that we do, a lot of the coastal wetland restoration work that we do. And it sort of falls on my shoulders to use all of the sort of the arrows in my quiver in terms of talking about the benefits of ecological restoration. And I'd be a fool not to hitch my wagon to something like blue carbon, which is really has not only the attention of people like us, but it brings me in the room with the energy people. And as Aisling indicated, that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts coordinated their energy and environment groups together just a few years ago. In many respects, energy is the dominant focus in the conservation and energy and environmental sectors. Energy tends to get sort of the main play. And for us to show relevance, we are not only talking about how we can use wetland restoration as an adaptation piece, but if we can start to talk about the carbon sequestration, the methane reductions, we become part of the mitigation discussion, which is huge because in some ways what we do is very esoteric. It's seen as maybe a luxury, is not necessarily a core component of government function. But yet when we can bring in these terms and we can bring in these new ways of looking at the work that we do, it brings a greater relevance. So that's my interest in blue carbon. It's sort of shameless in the sense that I'm trying to bring to the fore the work that we do, to bring a greater justification for our work. But it's also to make sure people know that we're part of the strategy. We're part of the solution. We're part of the piece that can make sort of climate change sort of strategies real. And the work that we do is very real. It's very tangible. You can show results. And so I think in that way, we are very interested in the whole discussion around blue carbon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tim. Kristin.
Thanks. So I'm going to tell you about 3 different aspects that the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve is involved in. The first is last December we hosted a blue carbon workshop, so many of the folks in this room came up to that. But we had about 45 participants from northeastern United States as well as the maritime Canadian provinces who came down for that workshop. And the focus was not only salt marshes but also seagrasses. And so we were talking about management and science gaps and opportunities for forming a more coherent community of scientists and researchers and managers who are interested in blue carbon in this part of the world. So that was pretty exciting. And we've also been involved in kind of 2 other things that I think are relevant here. One, we heard both Ariana and Lisa Marie talk about some of the funded projects through the CEC. So right now, myself and my co-PI, Eric Smith, who's the research coordinator down at the North Inlet Winnea Bay NER, are partnering with 8 reserves from around the country that span a salinity gradient. So we have 2 sites in the Great Lakes. We have a California site, one in Mississippi, the GTM Reserve, which is down in Florida, North Inlet, and in South Carolina and Delaware. And those 8 reserves went out and collected cores in the 4 dominant cover classes in each of those places. And we've been looking at carbon storage questions. And so does it matter, you know, if you're thinking about blue carbon and how much carbon is in a marsh and trying to scale up, does it matter where you collect that core? Does it matter to some of those estimates? So those are some of the questions that we're trying to answer in that project. And also, we're trying to look at one of the common methods for how you estimate carbon is using this loss on ignition term, which has popped up in some of the presentations over the last couple of days. So we're doing some paired measurements that are relating loss on ignition to actual measurements of carbon using a carbon nitrogen CH&N analyzer. So those paired measurements are showing some really interesting results, that there may be some reason to come up with some regional calibration curves for how we relate those two parameters. So we're writing that study up. We received funding about a year ago last March, and we're writing those results up right now. So to be continued, and if you're interested in those, be sure to be in touch with us. The last is that the National Estuarine Research Reserve actually just started a blue carbon, within the research coordinators community, just started a blue carbon work group. And it's pretty exciting. I don't know if you've had any experience trying to recruit people to work groups, but usually you get crickets when you ask for that. And we have a virtual meeting in the spring, and a quarter of the research coordinators actually volunteered to be on this work group, which is pretty exciting. So there's a lot of interest there. We've talked already internally about moving some of our blue carbon work out into seagrasses and how we might be able to do some latitudinal sorts of studies comparing across systems. And I think the reserve system is really poised to be able to I guess just take advantage of what it means to be part of a system to answer some of these larger scale, either regional or national questions around blue carbon.
Great, thank you very much. You know, one of the things I've really enjoyed about this project has been the communication between the science community and the user community. And here we have landowners, land managers, advisors to land managers. We have people working at the accounting side for the state. We have people working restoration. We have people working in the science. And it's really nice to bring this whole community together. So somewhat nervously, I'm going to ask, from everything you've heard in the last 2 days, how has your opinion evolved in terms of what you think can be done within your agency? Are there positives and negatives? Where do you think we can take this, or not, in the future? And let's actually go for ladies first this time. Aisling.
Okay. So, yeah, I think from the last few days, oh, I keep forgetting to use the mic. Okay, I'll take it out of this. Okay. So from the last couple of days, I think has been really helpful for me in learning more about the science behind blue carbon, what's going on, what are the studies that are available, because in part of, I definitely, in answer to the question first, I do think there's some great opportunities to incorporate this work into the work that we're doing at the policy level. And what we've already started, which I think is probably an answer to question 3, so I won't go into the details now, but we have started to work on a project that it has a blue carbon component. And so just being here in the last few days has helped me understand better who's doing what science is available, where are still the outstanding questions. I think that will be very useful as a project manager going forward and helping to be part of the project. What I wanted to say also in terms of incorporating it into our work was another thing that emerged from both yesterday and one of the working groups this afternoon was talking about the social cost of carbon, and I think that was very interesting too in thinking about with our clean energy and climate plan, we want to, there may be opportunities there to use some of the studies and the information learned over the last few days and thinking about, how do we do kind of a relative analysis of various policies to get a better understanding of what the carbon implications are. The question was really, do we see potential for incorporating it into a policy? Yeah. Yes, I think there's definitely a lot of potential there. Okay, yeah, so look forward to continuing discussions.
Kristin, if I might invite you next.
Can folks hear me? Or this is closer? Or you're good. Okay. So I think it's just I would reiterate Lisa Marie's comment that I think it's just a really exciting time to be doing blue carbon science. I think of that exponential curve, and there's just so much that's coming out right now, and so many synergies between results from all these different groups who are working on blue carbon. And I think it's so exciting. I think there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the communities, ecologists and geologists to actually kind of merge and marry on this issue. So I'm really excited. I think there's a lot of opportunities in terms of data mining, a lot of data that's already out there that we could use to answer some of these questions. So that echoes a point that, again, Lisa Marie made in her keynote address. And I'm excited about the opportunity to test some of the models that are coming out of the Bringing to Wetlands project. So I think that that will be really exciting. You know, I know they're putting in for this next round of science collaborative funding. We're hopefully, if that gets funded, with the Wells Reserve will be a tier 2 site for that project. So we'd be able to test whether or not that model works in a place that has a really large tidal range, for example, and different types of marshes. The geomorphology of our marshes are very different. So I'm really excited about that. I think that it's just an exciting time.
No, very much indeed, very cool. I think the opportunity to test it out in geomorphic settings is a very exciting next step forward, I think. John, perhaps may I invite you next, please?
Sure. Just to set the stage a little bit, the Conservancy is very interested in holistic restoration in coastal areas. We have really prioritized regionally from Cape Cod to Long Island Sound, southern New England, whole system is what we call it. The water quality and the nutrient issue in terms of excess nitrogen is really, you know, we never have a silver bullet. It'd be nice if we had a silver bullet, but that's the best silver bullet we have found for coastal restoration work in the southern New England region. So we're really focused on reducing nutrients. Obviously, there's a critical juncture between some of what we heard today in terms of carbon and sequestration and nutrients, which is complex, and I can't say I have a grasp of that, other than I've certainly understood that it's an important issue and it intersects with something that we have really put a focus on. Thinking more broadly about the Conservancy, we work in a lot of parts of the world that have a lot more capital in terms of blue carbon capital than we do here. The Coral Triangle, where we have vast mangroves and seagrass beds, and clearly from an organizational standpoint, that's probably the better bang for the buck in the position we're in right now versus New England. But it really makes me think, if we can get the enabling conditions right by reducing nutrients in coastal waters, we can do some proactive, we're working on shellfish restoration here in Massachusetts. I know that's on both sides of the blue carbon equation, and I'd like to learn more about that, particularly as it relates to aquaculture activities. And it seems like there's some emerging science on that. But we're really in a position where we've lost 80 to 90% of our seagrass in this part of the world. We know we've lost a considerable amount of salt marsh, and now the new threat is not building on it or digging it out, but instead losing it from sea level rise. So it seems to me, if we're really going to capitalize on the blue carbon around the coastal resources in New England, we need to get them back. We need some holistic restoration and time to get the resource back to build the capital so that we can start matching other parts of the world in terms of that. The one last thing I'll say, when we think about markets, and unfortunately I missed yesterday when there was the discussion about blue carbon markets, but one way we at the Conservancy try to get at that question is we ask the venture capitalist people, do you think this is a viable market for the sort of work we do? And I'd be really interested to run the blue carbon scenario for the sorts of restoration work we do through our venture capitalist connections and people that we ask that question. Just as a quick example, we were part of a consortium buying a shellfish hatchery about to go out of business on the Cape. And their first reaction was, are you nuts? You're going to invest in a losing business? But we've come around to understand it. And I wonder if blue carbon, we may learn a lot from the venture capitalist community about, is this really a business opportunity? And maybe they can tell us rather than the ecologist trying to tell them.
Very good point, thank you. Tim, please.
So I came into this conference thinking, okay, almost with a little bit of a VC hat on, saying, okay, how does our program with limited resources, not a lot of staff time, how do we want to invest in blue carbon? And I would say I came in as a skeptic, and I'm still skeptical. I think, be quite honest, the science isn't there yet for me to really feel like I can make this a major policy initiative in my shop and to really push it hard. And I feel like the science is too contradictory, or there's too many gaps, there's not enough synergy going on right now in the science for me to build a sort of a solid policy framework around. And so that's one thing that I think I'm a little bit skeptical to move forward on, although I do think that if we put this in the context of something greater in terms of holistic restoration as one ecosystem service in the overall framework, I think that's definitely a way to kind of, maybe the science isn't quite there, but yet we have all these benefits or co-benefits that go along with these projects, and we think very holistically, like the Nature Conservancy, in the way we address projects, that I think that there's opportunities there. Finally, I want to say that I have a real problem with this concept of additionality in the sense that you're trying to, especially in the voluntary market, trying to separate aspects of a wetland restoration or a river restoration project for the greenhouse gas benefits versus the wildlife benefits versus the water quality benefits. And to me, I think and I'd mentioned this to Steve, that it would be really great just to have, that, especially in the voluntary market, just not apply, not try to separate the two, because I think that's going to be sort of a very squirrely issue that we're going to have trouble dealing with. So in the end, the question is, how am I going to help move this forward and connect with this? And we've partnered with the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs to start, and with Steve, who's going to do the work, to start to account for the sort of budget, the greenhouse gas budget for a variety of wetland restoration projects, both in the coastal and in the freshwater realm, because in the freshwater realm, I think there's a great opportunity for restoration, especially here in Massachusetts with former cranberry bogs, and that might be, we might be adding a lot more methane into the system by restoring these freshwater Atlantic white cedar swamps, emergent swamps, and so there's also an overall kind of cost benefit that goes into it. And if we don't think holistically, if we just think about, sort of carbon as the new Atlantic salmon, we're going to get in trouble, because there's a lot of energy and effort that was put towards designing systems around a single species. I wouldn't want to see that same thing done around, a greenhouse gas, for example, which I know none of us would do, but I think we have to be careful about always pulling back and thinking about all the other benefits.
Yeah, I think that's very important, because it's very easy to get down to a single issue when you're trying to tell a story, and really pulling back and thinking about the wider context is a very important message to keep going. I'd like to open the questions to the audience, give a chance to respond to what you've heard, and maybe grill the panel a little bit. Who would like to go first?
Tim, I was wondering how you interact with the Massachusetts Coastal Zone Management and the policy side of affairs.
That's a really good question, and in some ways we really were formed through an alliance between CZM and DFG, and we took the Wetlands Restoration Program and the Riverways Program, we combined to create this division of ecological restoration. So we brought in a lot of coastal planners, coastal ecologists into our division. That was back in 2009, and so that way we have sort of inbred a kind of a coastal mentality, and with that we brought all of our portfolio of coastal wetland restoration projects that had been done at CZM for many, many years. And because of that, we have a very strong relationship with CZM. I think it could be stronger in terms of the resiliency thing and the resiliency piece and the storm smart coasts. A big part of that is the natural infrastructure piece, and we're very much, the practitioners of that. And so there probably could be a lot more that goes back and forth within those two realms. But one of the things that we really look to is, and it's harder and harder to do in the coastal realm, is trying to find and develop projects that require minimal intervention. And in the coastal area, tends to be a mix of engineering, soft and hard, that we just don't typically like to do. We like to go into systems, find out what the stressors are, do point interventions, and then let Mother Nature and Father Time take over. In the coastal zone, there's a lot more management. That's my sort of, maybe my bias, in terms of just a lot more infrastructure, a lot more it's harder to do the sort of the holistic restoration applications. You have to mix more of the hard infrastructure with the soft infrastructure. But we do have a fair bit of interplay between the two, but it probably could be improved. And I would like to see this whole concept of natural infrastructure be taken to the next level, so it combines some of the kind of the more pure restoration stuff that we like to do for ecosystems with some of the more urban and the coastal applications. To bring kind of that concept, and I know that TNC has been really pushing this in Massachusetts, of having more of a natural infrastructure under kind of more of a coordinated effort. And so, yes, we do coordinate, but we probably could coordinate a lot more.
I would like to speak as director of the One Health Epigenomics Initiative, and I would like to address the issue of, how do you talk to green investors? I found my ways to find those investors by asking them to think about healthy aquaculture, healthy seafood. Okay? So if you put in your model how much cadmium is bioaccumulated on the shellfish, or how much glyphosate you have on it, and you compare it with Goods Hall and Wegman supermarkets are selling on their organic seafood, and you find that actually it's contaminated, my investors, they are heading with me to Cuba. We are hoping for the opening of the embassy there, the consulate, and we are going to invest there with the women of the mangroves. They're thinking 2050. There are people willing to risk their money today for healthy seafood. Think about that.
I'll let Jon talk about aquaculture in Massachusetts.
Well, let me respond quickly if I can. Yeah, we completely agree with that approach. We've sold it as clean water and the possibilities of clean water, which means healthy seafood to eat, healthy ecosystems, healthy recreation. There's a lot to it, including environmental justice in areas of the state. So we have been exploring urban areas because of this, because it's related to food source, environmental justice, ecological sorts of affiliations related to that. We do hear from venture capitalist people, essentially for people who aren't aware, most of the money is in the venture capitalists' hands, and they really drive the markets and make the markets happen. So around septic system innovation so that we can remove nutrients from water, that's someone who we have to get to move, or it will never move. We'll never have a market for it. Seafood as well. VC people are now getting into aquaculture, including in Massachusetts. They're starting to consolidate and get larger. They constantly tell us they need more and more and more because they need a very big scale. So we wrestle with that and how sustainable that is. So good point, agree with it, and we're working on trying to get there.
I just wanted to address the uncertainty question, primarily because some of you are talking with business and other energy uses, and if you put blue carbon in the integrated assessment model, it's not going to be a winner compared to all these other potential things you can do. But one thing that really stands out from this data set in particular to me was how absolutely certain it was. I'm not talking about this was an incredible amount of data trying to tell the full story, but the one data set that really matters was that soil data, and it was solid, and it was basically really high rates of carbon sequestration and continuous, doing fine with, even though the sea level rise is growing quite high. And this is a low sediment system, so it was just kind of an amazing story to me of how resilient this marsh is compared to what models would generally project. So actually, I walked out of this with just total certainty that, oh yeah, this is absolutely storing carbon, long haul, this is good system. The other stuff, we're trying to figure out what it means, but I don't think it's a deal breaker. And also the methane numbers were really low. So this, to me, was one of the winner salt marshes stories that I've heard. Because again, you start with the solid stock data that's in the soil. That's where your story is, and then now we're trying to explain the whys of that. So
I just want to say that I came out feeling much more certain about this than uncertain. Maybe I'm the only person, but that's how I.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa.
I had a follow-up question that on the combining the natural restoration and the coastal resilience restoration, the initiatives that are going on for natural systems and human systems that we've been talking about, trying to identify and trying to find ways to bring that together. Are there ways, given that there are communities that are looking into coastal resilience planning, that there are kind of larger scale ecosystem-based people looking at restoration in certain systems? Is there a way to, since we have state people in the room now, to think about starting to coordinate better? Or do you see opportunities that could happen that just need a little bit of organizational reconfiguration to do? Or do you think it's there are larger barriers to that kind of thinking?
Well, I think one of the things that we really struggle with, and I'm going to be really perfectly frank with you in the coastal realm, is because we've been doing wetland restoration, mostly tidal restoration in Massachusetts for about 20 years, we've done a lot of the easier projects in Massachusetts, and now we're getting to the second tier, the harder projects, the herring rivers, either projects that are really expensive, or what's left are these projects where you can only do partial restoration because you have infrastructure you need to protect and you can't restore complete tidal hydrology. And you're starting to get into tide gates, which are, tide gates and fish ladders send my staff into apoplectic fits because they are not restoration activities. A good tide gate is never replaces full natural, tidal flow restoration. And so there is, I think, a place for it. I think that we have to really think hard in the restoration community in terms of our philosophy and the way we look at restoration, and we are firmly committed to what John talked about, this holistic restoration, pulling back, looking at ecosystem stressors, looking at watershed scale, stresses. But when we start to get into the second tier of projects or more urban projects or areas closer to the coastline, we have to sacrifice a lot in that regard, and projects become much more expensive. And that's why I think, this to circle back to the blue carbon, if we can achieve another funding source for the work that we do, then we can potentially develop other suites of projects, expand our portfolio, and dip into areas that may not have as much return on investment ecologically, but maybe socially do. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I'm here. I feel like the blue carbon is, did I call it green carbon?
Yeah.
Maybe I did, but thinking of money. But the blue carbon, I think, could potentially provide a funding source that we don't have for us to reevaluate the projects that we're not doing now. And we're probably not doing them because they have some critical barrier to implementation, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's cost, whether it's politics, that makes us shy away. But if we had money and we had an ability to build another system, and which blue carbon potentially can provide, then I think we can get to stuff like you're talking about.
I had a question for both Ashleen and Tim, being that you are under the same umbrella agency, and I hear Ashleen saying that you do see opportunity for policy considerations and application. I hear you, Tim, having some reservations. I think your words were being somewhat still skeptical about where the science is and how much to push that in policy. And so I think my question has to do with what is the linchpin for the skepticism aspect? Just wanted to know more about what is driving that. And then on Ashleen's side, like, what is driving kind of more the positive kind of look at it? I think both are important to consider, but just wanted to dig a little bit more into what's there.
I think my reasoning behind being maybe positive about it in terms of incorporating in policy is because we're a major focus of the work that we're doing over the next few months in terms of updating the Clean Energy and Climate Plan we realize that we have a gap in terms of our ability to track changes in land cover over time. And so this is like beyond the blue carbon piece, this is just in terms of land cover in general, land alteration due to development. We realized that we could track some of our energy and renewable policies really well, but we weren't able to track very well how our land use planning, smart growth, these types of policies are doing without better information on what is the climate, what's the greenhouse gas impact of changing land from one form to another. So whether it's forest into low density residential or agriculture into a commercial development. So part of what we're doing is trying to figure out like what information is out there or what additional analysis do we need to do. How can we develop a profile for different types of vegetation, different types of land cover, so that we can really understand what does that mean from a climate perspective. So I think that's kind of where like my, my sort of excitement and my thinking that I see opportunities for how to use this information to help inform our policy and planning going forward. That's kind of where it's come from. So just, we, as Tim mentioned earlier, a part of, we're collaborating on a project to look at the GHG budget of different restoration projects, and Steve Crooks is going to be working on that too. And so I feel that it's, this work is going to help inform us in terms of better understanding of what is the climate, what is the carbon impact of making changes in these areas. And it'll help inform us as to whether when we're thinking about where we want to invest our time and energy and resources, what are the good projects to do? Should we be looking at developing other types of goals and strategies that are geared more towards conservation and restoration as part of our, thinking about the global warming stuff? And there was something else on my mind I wanted to say about that, but I can't remember what it was now. Oh, I know what it was. Okay. So the other area that I think has some potential too is when we look at assessing the impacts of development in the past, our greenhouse gas policy right now in looking at projects is focused primarily on the energy side and somewhat on transportation, but we don't necessarily have accepted methodology or requirements around really looking at the potential lost carbon storage and sequestration of land alteration. So I just see this as sort of adding to that bank of knowledge that we might want to think about, considering more as far as state permitting and investment when we look at development projects.
Just to be short, I think the biggest concern that I have in terms of the way kind of the science might dictate the policy is can we count on these values over time, especially when you add in something like sea level rise or some of the other impacts we see with climate change. And so if we account for something, is it something that we can trust in over the long haul? And I know obviously you can't necessarily bank on the fisheries remaining the same or getting better. There are other factors that influence that. But I think thinking about, especially in coastal systems with sea level rise, I'm just worried that we're talking about just a limited benefit period before those benefits could be potentially lost. And so that, I think, if I could be assured that that's not the case and that there is some permanence to it in the temporary as well as in the longer term, even if the longer term is diminished, then I think that's something that I get more comfortable with as a policymaker. And you're talking to someone who, I'm not a scientist. I'm definitely, I'm not someone who, but I know that the people I have to talk to get money to build program capacity, I think I just need more confidence and more understanding that these are values that are going to persist for me to build a program around. But that's not to say that I'm going to try and I'm going to start that process.
How do we take what's happening here as a first step and expand it more regionally? What are the panel's thoughts on that? And maybe, well, I'll open it to the panel and see who might like to respond.
I'll take a crack. at that. You know, we think about this a lot. We're thinking more and more regionally. As I mentioned, here in Massachusetts, we think a lot about southern New England. The other way is the Gulf of Maine, and that, you know, those folks think regionally as well. I just don't work there that much. But really between Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Long Island down to Long Island Sound, you know, we ask this very question about everything we do in the coastal setting. You know, our nutrient work has really gotten down to regional policies. You know, we're thinking about regional data sharing agreements for septic system testing because that's been the problem of getting nutrient-reducing septic systems in the ground. So when you think about blue carbon, I think we need to quantify the problem at that scale. And I don't think we've done that, at least I'm not aware of that. So if we wanted to take southern New England, we need to know what the blue carbon capital is. I would also suggest it's important to know, and maybe this is part of the capital, I'm not that well versed in the lingo, but shellfish are a good example in building reefs. Are we building sources or sinks, and how does that fit in the overall equation? We should know whichever one we're building when we're doing restoration, for example. Also the secondary benefits of having seagrass potentially behind these sorts of structures. So it gets complicated in terms of the capital, but I would suggest that we need to measure it from the onset from a regional perspective.
Very good. Anybody else?
Well, I had a thought just in terms of regional collaboration, coordination, because I was thinking of it from the energy side of things. We have RESEE and, you know, New England approach, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and there's also the Coalition of New England Governors, I think CONEG, who, and I haven't been directly involved with them, but I know there's a lot of collaboration and conversations among New England governors about energy and about transportation, and I believe they do have an environment committee. So I don't know whether, you know, the coastal issues and adaptation stuff is on the radar, or if there is a group. But if, you know, that might be something to tap into, to have the conversation at the regional level. Just a thought.
Good idea. Now, one of the things I've noticed on the West Coast is that, you know, California developed this market-based approach, and there's certainly a lot of interest all the way up through into even British Columbia. We're certainly thinking about the same sort of way in Washington State, Oregon, and of course Mexico. And I think, you know, if one area starts building up ideas, they may seem to spread along the coast. So that governor's sort of communication, intercommunication sounds very promising. Anybody else like to opine?
That one was punted to me, so I'll take a stab. There is a lot of work in the Gulf of Maine, so that, you know, there are existing groups like through NERACOOS, so part of the Integrated Ocean Observing System that's looking at sentinel site sorts of things. I think there's an opportunity for blue carbon to be woven into that. Certainly thinking about US and Canadian sorts of interplays, like through NROC, and I'm going to forget all these different acronyms, but that one's something, Regional Ocean Council, somebody can jump, okay. Somebody's giving me a thumbs up. Chris is giving me one. I think then there's two other kind of opportunities right now that I think this could be, blue carbon could be woven into, and there are two different National Science Foundation funded opportunities through the EPSCoR program. So right now, Maine and New Hampshire have a $4 to $5 million EPSCoR grant to fund NEST, which is the New England Sustainability Consortium, and they're focused on healthy beaches and safe shellfish. And so there's a number of different aspects to what that project is doing, but I think there could be a blue carbon aspect that could be woven into that. They're about halfway through that 3-year project, so I'm not sure where the opportunities are. But there was another EPSCoR award that was to Maine recently through the University of New England and the University of Maine called CNET, and I forget what the acronym there stands for. Scientists love acronyms, but that focuses on aquaculture, and so in integrated aquaculture. So thinking about other sorts of things that we can grow aside from shellfish along with shellfish, and so taking more of an ecosystem approach. And Barry Costa-Pierce is the lead on that, with some others who I'm forgetting. But I think there could be some potential there to weave in blue carbon opportunities from that perspective. Also put a plug that I think in terms of mining different types of data, I think there's a real opportunity around the Gulf of Maine, and I know that this has been floated by others, to tie into place-based, across different place-based systems. So we have long-term ecological research stations like Plum Island that we've heard some about, but also long-term field stations that are associated with colleges and different universities, along with places like the National Estuarine Research Reserve. But if we were to marry across these different organizations in a coordinated way, I think there's really some opportunity to answer some bigger questions that are happening around the Gulf.
So I'm going to push back a little and say that the coordination for, especially on restoration in the Gulf of Maine, is pretty much not happening. It used to happen. Jon was an integral part of the Gulf of Maine Council for Marine Environment, part of the NOAA partnerships, which basically folded. There was a lot of collaboration, connection, and I think it's happening at the NGO level, but I don't think it's happening in terms of the states collaborating. And I have bias. I think the states are where a lot of the innovation is happening when it comes to restoration in New England. And so I think that actually one of the models that's been talked about, and Steve mentioned it, is this idea that trying to set up some sort of voluntary carbon offset fund by identifying a few companies, marquee companies in the Gulf of Maine region that are interested and have a connection to, whether it's fossil fuel industry, whether it's gas distribution, to building that capacity back again and really pushing where there are great opportunities for restoration that have excellent carbon sequestration opportunities. And that's particularly, I think, in Maine, where it's not happening at the pace because the capacity is not there, the infrastructure is not there, and I think there's great opportunity to make that happen, and I think it could happen through some sort of collaboration, public-private, because you look at the politics of the states, you look at the trends of the states, and I think the public-private piece really needs to be pushed a lot harder and a lot farther for us to really make a dent on the restoration side. Now, on the research side, it might be happening, and there might be the collaborations that will connect. But I think if you don't have the implementation with the monitoring that comes with some of these certification programs, which is great. I think that's one of the things that could be really fantastic. It could be a great sort of shot in the arm to the research community, is making that implementation dollars happen and then folding in, a significant piece. I mean, you looked at Tom's just the accounting for Herring River. If we did that to some VCS standards, it's $500,000, and that would provide such great. I mean, it's kind of daunting in some ways, but it would create a great opportunity for advancing the research in and around what we're talking about here for the last 2 days. But I guess it's a challenge, I think, that we are not overcoming right now, and we're not even pushing. But this, the blue carbon could be the spur that makes that happen. And I don't know, Jon, you're an expert in this realm too, and I don't know if you agree with me, but I sort of feel like there ain't much happening, especially in the Gulf of Maine right now, even with the
I would like to respond.
Good.
All right, so here we go. So there, let's put things in a little bit of perspective. So on a gross scale, I do agree with you in terms of salt marsh restoration, certainly. I would say that Maine is quite active in a lot of river restorations, and I think that that's where a lot of the emphasis for restoration has been. So I would agree on the salt marsh side, there's not, but let's put things in perspective too. Maine has 5,000 kilometers of coastline, which is like the coastline of California. And we only have one person in any division of our state agency who works on salt marshes at all. And so I think that there's a capacity issue there. We're a resource in the state. I think that we provide a lot of expertise on what's happening in salt marshes, but if we have one person who's looking at this through the Maine Coastal Program. So that's in 5,000 miles of coast.
Yeah, that's my point.
That's a lot. Yeah. Oh, I agree. I didn't say that on tape.
Not really a question, but I'm I've been thinking about this, particularly after our policy discussion earlier today, of which all of you were there. And it seems to me that if we're going to make any headway, particularly at the state level, to start thinking about blue carbon, and it's another ecosystem service provided by coastal wetlands. That's not even written in our policy right now. We recognize recreational values, we recognize habitat values, we recognize storm surge and erosion values, we recognize water pollution abatement values, but there's nothing in our policies right now that say blue carbon is an ecosystem service. So I think a simple thing for us to do is to just incorporate that as another ecosystem service and make some findings to that effect, and that just sort of sets the tone for the future, but at least that's a placeholder and a start. As the science develops better and the market develops, we can start talking about blue carbon offsets and all the other paradigms that could be out there for blue carbon.
Yeah, that's a great point. Would anybody like to comment before? Please, John.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Great point. You know, Massachusetts has a lot to be proud of in terms of getting green infrastructure on the radar, including the regulators, the agency people, NGOs have really pushed green infrastructure. And I see this as a component of green infrastructure, and that avenue has really opened up recently, and the state should be proud of that. There's a lot happening, including in the environmental bond bill. Just today, CZM put out requests for monies for grants for coastal green infrastructure work, which could have a blue carbon component. So I think we need to build off something that has traction, and it isn't only Massachusetts. I think Massachusetts has done this particularly well, and some of the folks in this room and some who have left or were here previously are responsible for that. Just a suggestion, you know, we get wrapped up in terminology and concepts, and people get single-tracked on that, so we should build off the momentum.
Very good. And I think I'm going to ask one last question about where you think we can go next. I think you've answered a lot of this question already in this great discussion. And you know, one of the things that we kind of realize is going along is this concept of blue carbon is starting to bubble up. And it's a lot of it's all about the discussion. It's discussion among scientists. It's making it aware to the communities, discussion with people that work with agencies. It's all about bringing this concept into discussion, socializing it, so that policy writers bring it into their discussion, because not much is going to happen unless the policy people are integrating it within their discussion. And that requires more communication. And I think the point about green infrastructure is very important. You know, maybe one term we might start using is blue-green infrastructure. You know, because we're bringing wetlands together with the wider green infrastructure that's being developed and led here. So maybe as a closing question, I'll ask that. Where does our panel see things going next? What are our next steps? What are your recommendations to the people in the audience who are, you know, maybe going to write grants or talk to policy analysts or talk to their congressmen or just talk to their community? What should we be doing next?
Well, I just want to jump in and say I think that the groundwork is really well laid. I think that in some ways I was mentioning that if you had cap and trade come in when Obama was, you know, spearheading it, and you probably would have had to like build what's the saying? Build the airplane while it's flying. You're trying to figure out how to build a system. What's great is in some ways it provided an opportunity for the science to come up to a certain level, for the policy start to mature. And so in some ways I think this is a really exciting time for this, because you weren't, you know, kind of just making it up as you go along, but instead now you're doing it in a really well concerted and thoughtful way, and really having to be creative about how to make these things happen, whether it's on a voluntary market or it's a regulated market. And so what I think is you just keep going, doing the things that you're doing, and keeping the body of science and information flowing and growing, and the policy people and the implementation folks and the management side keep pushing, then I think that this is coming to a nice head. And I sort of feel like there's a good energy around this that was completely undetectable in the last 5 years. So what's great is that this is actually, even though I was a bit pessimistic and a bit of a skeptic, I'm actually kind of excited about being a small part of this overall effort.
Yeah, I would just add to that, yeah, second that, to keep the conversations and the communication going. Because, I think just in terms of where I was in my knowledge or thinking about it last year compared to now, and that's just from, Tana Marie and her team reaching out and sharing the information and the work that's ongoing, and then which stimulated conversations, within our agencies, with Tim and with others at Coastal Zone Management, etc. So I think just, keep those conversations going, and I think that'll, spin off, some really good stuff.
John, please.
Sure. It seems to me that coastal resilience is not going away. The problem isn't going away. We are now involved in 2 in the water green infrastructure feasibility studies, one in Boston Harbor and one in just down the way in Plymouth. And those are really merging our green infrastructure with our coastal flooding and erosion problem and getting dual benefit. So it seems like the added benefit of dealing with that problem, or if you could commingle those, the better. We're talking about building offshore reefs that would break waves, but then possibly create a back barrier environment that might become places for seagrass restoration. For example, where there was always too much energy because of things we've done and manipulated, et cetera. But it just seems like that is not going away as an important factor, and I know that's already been discussed, but just thought I'd mention it.
No, thanks very much, John. And I guess that brings us to the research that's associated with green infrastructure. How do you see all of these things, Kristin?
Yeah, so I think there's 3 things. I think it comes down to grandmas, green infrastructure, and I was trying to come up with a 3rd G, but I couldn't. So spatial variability and geospatial variability. There we go.
That's a seller.
Yeah. So grandmas goes back to Steve's point yesterday, is that I'm always continually surprised when talking about blue carbon, when I use that term, how many even scientists don't know what the term is. So I think the more that we can talk about it and talk about it in different types of settings, the stronger we'll make our cause here. The green, I think hitching the blue carbon to green infrastructure wagon is a really smart one, and that was even before coming up here. That was my one. We got these questions ahead of time, but that was going to be my my point on this question, I guess. But and that's something that not only John's talked about here, but Ariana was talking about, how can we, from a grant perspective, because anybody who's a scientist in this room and others who have been trying to get grants on blue carbon, there's no RFP that's come with blue carbon. We thought there might be with MIT Sea Grant, but then they took that away and just focused on OA this year. So yeah, so I think we have to find creative ways to get funding for it. And then the 3rd one, the geospatial, thanks for that, the 3rd G, the geospatial variability and carbon storage. When I think about marshes and carbon, they look like heat maps in 3D to me. And so trying to understand the variability in carbon storage, I think is something that's really an interesting question to be asking right now.
Thank you. And so with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for what's been actually a fantastic discussion.